Hello, my name is Chris Core. Thank you for attending my presentation here at the 2021 COSMA Conference, Racial Tasking in College Football Coaching Hirings. I'm a doctoral candidate at the University of South Carolina. I'm getting ready to propose my dissertation, actually, and this is really the foundational theoretical concept that I'm working through with my dissertation. So my right, I haven't proposed yet, so I don't necessarily have findings. So this is more of a theoretical conversation, a theoretical presentation of where my research is leading regarding my dissertation. So really the theoretical jumping off point here is critical race theory as the kind of the foundational component of this research. And it starts in critical legal scholars, right? Identifying legal decisions in U.S. history and how that perpetuated class differences and furthered a hegemonic structure in America, assigning Black people to a subordinate group, right? And you have this this concept that legal action is reducing the number of overtly racist components of American society, right? But but they're not they're not legal action isn't changing anything really tangible, right? Where anything intangible, the ascription of Black people to a subordinate group, social issues we have in society. So we see in critical legal scholars um, more of a historical context rather than an activism component. Um, and and really looking at critical legal scholars, and one of the foundational components of that is looking at Brown v. Board of Education and the idea that the decision, right, separate is inherently unequal, right? On the outside, it accomplishes um, it accomplishes getting rid of an overtly racist thing, right? Segregation in schools. But really, it doesn't solve issues like redlining and funding differences, things that are going on that are disproportionately affecting Black students, right? So we look at critical legal scholars is looking at an analysis of the historical ramifications of case law. Critical race theory comes out of that with more of an activism component, a call to achieve social change, social justice within American society specifically. Counter storytelling is a part, a tenet of critical race theory. Um, and Richard Delgado is the pioneer here in the 90s. And this idea that the the stories, the beliefs and practices that are become normalized within society are dictated by the dominant group within the hegemonic structure. The subordinate group, though, is the counter storytelling, that their stories need to be told, and often the voices of the subordinate group are marginalized. But sharing their stories and creating an understanding between the dominant and the subordinate group of what's going on is extremely important for social change to occur, right? So um, within the context of college football coaching hirings, counter storytelling is the historical context of being a college football coach is a white male, right? And that hasn't changed much over the 150-year history of college football. Head coaches are still 80% of head coaches in Power Five football are white, and we see each year this kind of gets ramped up in December, January, when you go through firing and hiring of coaches, of the lack of minority representation in college and really the NFL, right? We've talked about um, Black coordinators that are overly qualified to be head coaches. Eric Bieniemy of the Kansas City Chiefs has been discussed now 3 seasons in a row as being passed over for a head coaching job, and he's led the most prolific offense in a 3-year period in football, in NFL history. Right? He has a quarterback that is on track to be mentioned as one of the greatest of all time, and he's passed over year in and year out. And there's a component of that is when racialized, an interesting conversation that needs to be had, right? So the subordinate group in this instance is Black coaches that are underrepresented in authoritative roles in college football. So looking at coaching hirings from the tenet of critical race theory of interest convergence, which is stating that racial equality and equitable practices are only going to be pursued by the racial majority when it benefits them or serves their interest. And I talked about Brown v. Board of Education earlier. Bell writes about the ulterior motives of Brown v. Board of Education, right? There's not only domestic unrest, right, and protests and everything that's coming with the civil rights movement, but there's also a Cold War going on and a push for democracy over communism on an international scale. And so when looked at from a foreign perspective, America looks like it's in upheaval, right? This is what democracy is, right? We're Americans are talking about freedom for everyone, but in their own country, that's not the practice, right? So the ulterior motives of Brown v. Board of Education in that ruling and the specific phrase "separate is inherently unequal" are an example of interest convergence, where the interests of the Black population in American society and Black students is aligning with the interests of the hegemonic structure of white society, right? And specifically in this case, government, and the push to further democracy worldwide, right? During this struggle with at the time the Soviet Union, and I talked about the separate unequal and the disproportional effect and this illusion of racial reform. And the illusion of racial reform, I think, is an interesting thing to bring up in the context of practices like the Rooney Rule and minority hiring requirements, quotas, interview quotas. Right, you have to interview a Black coach before making a hiring decision in both college and the NFL. In the NFL, that's called the Rooney Rule, named after Art Rooney of the Pittsburgh Steelers. It's an illusion of racial reform. The Rooney Rule, I believe, was implemented in 2004. In the early 2000s, it was implemented, and we haven't seen the number of Black coaches really change all that much compared to white coaches, and the number of second chances that white coaches get at being a head coach compared to Black coaches. But practices like the Rooney Rule and minority hiring interview quotas, right? You have to interview a minority candidate in college football before hiring a head coach. Practices like that give the illusion of reform and equal opportunity, when really it's not doing much to change the system in place, the hegemonic structure. So racial stacking and racial tasking play into college. They tie to critical race theory, but they play into college football hiring decisions in an interesting way. Racial stacking is is the example is in youth sports. It's a very prominent example, right? If you have 10 players go out for the basketball team, the white players are going to be put at the point guard position, and the black players are going to be put at positions that emphasize more skill and athleticism, right? So the white players in positions that emphasize decision making and processing, quarterback. In volleyball, the libero, or in basketball, the point guard, right? Players that are in leadership roles that are designed to, their function is to process and make decisions and serve as a leader on the team. Typically, white players are stacked there in sports, whereas black players are stacked at, in football, there's a term, right? Skill position. In basketball, it would be wing player, right? These are emphasizing athletic, purely athletic characteristics over mental capacity. And we've seen an increase in black quarterbacks since the early 2000s in college football, but a component of racial stacking, racial tasking, has seen that black quarterbacks are tasked with different responsibilities than white quarterbacks. So black quarterbacks are tasked to run the ball more than white quarterbacks. We think of Lamar Jackson, right? And he's the current example as the reigning NFL MVP and Heisman Trophy winner in college, of an athlete that is an athlete that is asked at the quarterback position to run the ball in a very high number of reps, right? He's asked to sacrifice his body much more than white quarterbacks are. Where Lamar Jackson's arm talent might be as good as or better than white quarterbacks that aren't asked to run. And why that matters for a couple of reasons. When you're tasking black quarterbacks as athletes, right? We have terms in the recruiting process. Dual threat quarterback is a ranking system for high school football recruits, and pocket passer is they're separated. There's two types of quarterback you can be in high school football rankings: a dual threat quarterback, one that runs frequently, and a pocket passer. Those really serve as labels, white and black, a lot of the time. Where dual threat quarterbacks are a lot of times black, pocket passers are most of the time white. So that's a prime example of racial tasking in kind of an implicit way, implicitly listed way, terminology. So why that matters is we see when black quarterbacks compared to white quarterbacks are tasked with running the ball in different responsibilities. A couple of things here: hindering the analytical approach and understanding of the game, limiting develop of throwing skills, and heightening injury risk, right? If you're running the ball more, you have more of a chance of injury, putting your body on the line in taking hits, right? All three of these play into limiting professional opportunity and your ability to make a living, make it in the NFL, right? In terms of becoming a quarterback that has the skill set to be able to succeed in the NFL. So there's a disproportional outcome of racial tasking black quarterbacks with different roles than white quarterbacks. So within coaching staffs, a college coaching staff is made up of 11 full-time coaches. So typically that's your head coach and 10 assistants. 2 of the assistants are generally your coordinators, your offense and your defensive coordinator. Your head coach is obviously the leader of that group, followed by your offensive coordinator, which leads his offensive assistant coaches, and the defensive coordinator, which leads their respective defensive assistant coaches. So while titles, right, technically all 10 non-head coaches are titled assistant coaches, their roles, their tasks, and their responsibilities often differ. So recruiting is coined as the lifeblood of college sports. And Black coaches tend to have more of a responsibility to recruit than white coaches. 67% of 63%, excuse me, of college football players in the Power Five conferences are Black, and over 70% of the starters, so the players that are on the 22 players on the field, having a direct more of an impact on the outcome of the game in terms of a win and a loss, are Black, a larger percentage. So the importance of recruiting can't be understated, right? And we know that. But the stigma of being labeled a recruiter often negatively affects a coach's ability to move up the coaching ladder and seek higher level positions. Black coaches are, this is important to note, often have more responsibility to monitor players that are currently on the team, right? We just talked about the number of players that are Black. Black coaches are typically tasked in a father figure type role, a disciplinarian of those players, right? And why this matters is we see that athletic directors, when making head coaching hiring decisions, value leaders. And the ascription to leaders, that term is coaches that are play callers. Well, coordinators are typically white. And so while assistant coaches are more often than not a racial minority, coordinators are much more likely to be white, and head coaches are even more likely to be white. And so interest convergence plays a role in that, in the processes of a Black coach wanting a job on a college football Power 5 team, right? That's a prestigious position in coaching. And the white head coach or the white coordinator valuing the Black coach's ability to recruit and the potential for them to serve as a monitor for current players on the team. Those are important things, especially given the importance of recruiting, right? So the disproportionate effect that we're looking at, though, is in the hiring process, and athletic directors valuing leaders, play callers. Leaders is just the term I'm using here. Coaches that serve in leadership roles. You can insert management if you want, right? And if you wanted to use more of a professional terminology when hiring a head coach. So how does this play out in college sports? 80% of head coaches are white. I've mentioned that, but 52% of assistant coaches, position coaches, identify as a racial minority. Typically, the progression of coaching progression, the coaching ladder is graduate assistant, assistant coach, coordinator, head coach. That's a very common, more often than not, when you say the climbing the coaching ladder, that's what that means. And it's the same as entry level, lower management, mid management, upper management, right? To use that professional analogy again. What this is saying, though, when we look at the percentages, head coaches, the white head coaches, are being hired from a smaller candidacy pool, right? 48% of position coaches, of assistant coaches, are white, but 80% of head coaches are white. So the candidacy pool for uh, for athletic directors when making hiring decisions is smaller percentage wise than the candidacy pool of racial minorities. Uh, an interesting thing to point out is that only 24% of graduate assistants are Black. Graduate assistants typically are former players a lot of the time, and we know that college football is, in terms of athletes, is a predominantly Black sport. So it's interesting to see that 24% of graduate assistants are Black compared to a much larger number of white graduate assistants. So why does all this matter? What am I doing? Why have you listened for this long? Racially tasking Black coaches as recruiters affects their opportunities for advancement, right? Athletic directors value play callers, not recruiters, when making hiring decisions. And while recruiting is incredibly important, typically in terms of the head coaching hiring decision, that is a responsibility that's passed along to assistant coaches. So a head coach's ability to recruit isn't necessarily as valuable as the assistant coach's ability to recruit. And that gets into NCAA rules, where in the spring evaluation period, where coaches are allowed to leave and go to high school campuses to evaluate prospects, high school athletes, the head coach isn't allowed to go on those, right? They're only allowed to go in the fall to a select number of off-campus visits. So the importance of being a recruiter is placed on the assistant coach, while it's important for the head coach to have the ability to recruit. The vast importance is placed on assistant coaches in college football based off the rules that govern recruiting. Where future research goes from here, and back to critical race theory, that Black assistant coaches are marginalized in that this isn't talked about much, right? And I think if you sat down with most people, and I've ended the research, this is now my personal opinion. My background is in college football recruiting. I worked at the University of Florida and the University of Missouri in the recruiting departments there. And you see Black coaches that are almost typecast in a way to a specific role that you can't shake for the rest of your career. And there's specific assistant coach positions. So what I mean by that is a position coach, that they're all assistant coaches, right? The same title. A position coach can be a running backs coach or a wide receivers coach or an offensive line coach, right? Quarterback coaches typically go on to be offensive coordinators, which again, that's a leadership role, valued. It's a play calling role, valued when making a hiring decision for a head coach. Most of the time, a running backs coach, right, won't go on to serve in the role of offensive coordinator. And again, this is just my personal opinion. Those and running backs coaches are typically going to be Black and tasked as recruiter, right? So you'll see a number of coaches that serve as recruiting coordinator in addition to their role as an assistant coach, a position coach. Typically, those are coaches that coach skill position groups, defensive backs, wide receivers, running backs, where Black players overwhelmingly are a higher percentage of players at those positions. So where this intersects with my research going forward with my dissertation is looking at what I'm talking about. So it's not a personal opinion anymore, right? And researching positions on coaching staffs and researching the trajectory of coaches within Power Five football. So where they started as a graduate assistant, what level, high school, college, professional, and how their coaching trajectory to where they are today. Um, I'll collect a database on that and run statistics on it, and hopefully at a conference in the future, if this was interesting to you, you'll hear a presentation where I have statistical findings that are I think going to support the concept of racial tasking and the disproportionate effect in the hiring process of head coaches that has on the population of Black coaches in college football. The critical race theory and the component of activism is extremely appealing to me, and I think that this level of research has a potential to have impact in that way, in an activism way, promoting anti-racism in sports, and giving a voice to a marginalized population as well, while also describing the realities of discriminatory practices that are happening in the hiring process, exposing practices like the Rooney Rule for ostensibly being there to promote equal opportunity, but really they're not serving in that function for a variety of other things, for a variety of other reasons. That's what this research is. So I know this is a little bit different of a research presentation, kind of just a theoretical, it's not a research presentation in terms of a presentation, right? And it's more of just a theoretical conversation. I look forward, if this was interesting to you and you want to have a conversation about this during the Q&A session, I would love to entertain that, and think this is fascinating and a really important thing in sport that reaches beyond kind of a call for social justice. I think this has a true activism component to it that can be tangibly illustrated and have actionable items attached to it. So thank you for watching this presentation. Again, look forward to seeing you in the Q&A if this was interesting to you, and I hope you're enjoying the rest of the COSMA conference. Thank you.
I do have not a question, but more of a comment. Like, you talked about looking at taking pieces of this and moving forward for some sort of publication. Where are you going to focus first? Like, what do you see coming out first from this study once you're finished?
I think the findings that will be, I think, of most value to the field will be the trajectory of what it takes to become a head coach. That's something we talk about, right? It's climbing the coaching ladder. You hear that all the time. Oh, he's climbed the coaching ladder. He's put in his time. My theory, and from my hypothesis and from my experience in college football, I think that white coaches climb the ladder faster and maybe skip rungs on the ladder, to keep using that metaphor, that Black coaches do, minority coaches do. And I say that because there's much more GA representation in terms of white males. There's much more, but then there's more assistant coach representation of minorities. But then there's more coordinator representation and more head coach representation. And somewhere along that line of that traditional trajectory, right? GA, position coach, coordinator, head coach, something's happening. And we've seen it recently in the NFL specifically. We just saw it at my program, at my school, right? South Carolina just hired Shane Beamer from Oklahoma, and he was the tight ends coach. He's never managed an offense or defense, right? He's never been a coordinator. I think that's interesting, these skipping steps along the way. And I think that showing that trajectory in a graphical representation, comparing white coaches and black coaches is potentially really valuable. So I think that's the first thing that I kind of want to tease out of the data once I collect all of it.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's great. I mean, I now live in Colorado, but I'm also an Eric Bieniemy fan and his
Yeah.
connection with Colorado. And then again, being a Lions fan, and they hired someone who said we're going to bite their kneecaps, and when we stand up and they fall down, we're going to, whack them again. I mean,
Yeah.
I don't really know a whole lot about that person, so I shouldn't judge, but it's just kind of interesting for me and to hear what your research is digging a little bit deeper in terms of that actual progression and where those gaps might be. And, I don't know, when he keeps saying they don't interview well, what does that mean? I mean, I don't claim to understand, but I would love, to learn a little more about that.
Yeah. And tagging off that, a lot of the research I collect, I try to always incorporate a qualitative piece, because I think exactly what you're saying, having, even if it is not representative, right? 2 to 3 people, which is a lot of time with this population, all you can get, if you can get that, having them answer that question. What does it mean? The stereotypical, oh, minority candidates don't interview as well. Oh, minority candidates have such and such. They're labeled as recruiters. What are your job responsibilities? Even if it's just 2 or 3, I think providing that context, I think qualitative data in that sense is extremely important. And I put it in a finding section a lot of the time of, here's what's happening. Here's someone within the industry explaining their specific experience related to what's happening to provide context. So I think absolutely that's something that I've thought about, and I try to incorporate in a lot of what I do, because you're reading the findings and you're like, well, what does this mean? I'm still reading it, but no one's answered this question, right? We hear this every coaching cycle and hiring cycle in both college and the NFL. What does it mean? I think providing context to that is something that I'm definitely going to do before I move towards publication.
Chris, I have a quick question for you.
Yeah, Zach.
And I apologize if my question was something that you addressed in your presentation. I actually plan to watch your presentation just after this.
You're good.
So I have not yet seen it. So if I'm asking a question that you already addressed.
You're good. We've talked about what we both research and all that before. So yeah.
Exactly. So, okay. So I have a proportionality versus head count question. So you had mentioned that there's more white coaches on each rung of the ladder, right? Or at each stage in the process. How does that relate? Does that relate to proportionality? So is there, based upon the races of the individuals, is there the appropriate percentage of or proportion of those individuals at each stage of the rung? And then my also underlying question to that would be, how do you determine appropriate levels of proportionality? Is it based upon, the number of individuals of that race who are players, who are coaches, who are like how is that all determined, right?
So proportionality, and I might have misspoke, is taken out of it because there's a larger percentage of minority assistant coaches than white coaches. So if the natural trajectory is graduate assistant, position coach, coordinator, head coach, and position coaches, which there's 8 position coaches on each staff, right? A football staff is 11 full-time coaches. Traditionally, it's head coach, 2 coordinators, 8 position coaches. If the position coaches make up the candidates for the coordinator pool, right? And there's a larger percentage of minority position coaches, but then 80% of coordinators are white, the proportionality, it's not part of the conversation, right? It's almost overtly skewing. It is overtly skewing one way, right? And then the percentage of head coaches goes even higher that are white compared to black, right? So I guess the proportionality between coordinators and head coaches would exist, right? In terms of hiring a head coach with coordinator experience, but that plays into this relatively new trend that I was talking about, skipping rungs on the ladder, right? Shane Beamer at South Carolina just did this, skipping coordinator, and I know we're jumping around using NFL and college examples when in my studies more college, you have a guy like Eric Bieniemy who I don't know how else you can prove yourself, right? From a professional standpoint in that league that's stuck being a coordinator. And he's a specific case study, right? What in the world's going on there? But that's happening around college football as well. You see guys like that have been stuck in coordinator roles around college football that have excelled, but they can't crack becoming a head coach. And that's when I get into the racialization of your job responsibilities. And we know from previous research, Black coaches are tasked with being recruiters in college football. They're tasked with being a father figure, a leader on the roster, right? When you have 80% of your scholarship players in the Power Five are Black, the value of having Black coaches on your staff to go into as a recruiter at Florida and Missouri. I was never going into inner city St. Louis to recruit from Missouri. That would have been suicide for us recruiting, right? I'm not going to be able to relate. We're going to send someone that's from that background, right, into that environment to recruit. I'll go all over the state of Missouri and recruit the rural parts of the state and have immense appeal. And so will our Black coaches, right? Have appeal in those areas. There's some areas they won't. And you can think about that from a cultural standpoint, a geographic standpoint, right? But there's a strategy in when I'm sending coaches on the road, who I send where, and everyone recruits a geographic area. There's strategy when I'm at Missouri as the director of recruiting. I can't send certain people into certain areas. So if St. Louis and Dallas are our primary recruiting bases, and we know from previous research that Black coaches are tasked as recruiters. I'm hypothesizing that they're getting stuck in the role of assistant coach and not able to achieve kind of a climbing that coaching ladder, right? And getting into managerial positions on a coaching staff because they're valued as recruiters. And that's where the value is seen, not as a play caller or a leader of a team as a head coach. Yeah, that's a good question though. And the proportionality, that's something to think about with coordinators and head coaches, sure, but at the base level of assistant coach to coordinator, it's not even part of the equation because there are more minority assistant coaches. And then 72 or 75% of coordinators, whatever the number was in my presentation of coordinators, are white. And the number gets even higher in college football as you move up to head coach.
Isn't that part of the problem though, that deciding that certain coaches based on race should go recruit here and should not go recruit there? I mean, I'm looking at, like, I was a basketball coach for 20 years and majority of my assistant coaches were all part-time. I went everywhere. It didn't matter. Like, that was never a thought. And I realized basketball, football are different sports and all that, and different, and male female aspect. But, you know, even if two coaches go together, one Black, one white, whatever, wouldn't that help solve the problem better than keeping coaches, Blacks only go to the Black coaches go to the inner cities, white coaches go to the rural areas?
And that's a theoretically, yes, right? In a perfect world environment, absolutely, right? That that having that cultural connectivity and immediate relationship with someone of your own race, right? Or someone that's from the background that you are, right? I grew up in the urban area, a major metropolitan area in the inner city. So did this coach. Having that relationship with them in a perfect world, just based off that, maybe doesn't exist, right? And we don't see those things, but that's not the case, right? And ignoring those things, and this is getting into a theoretical conversation in critical race theory a little bit. Ignoring those things devalues the whole process in a way, right? Because you can't extrapolate them out. They're part of who we are. They're ingrained in us sociologically, culturally, right? It's a part of who we are. So yes, maybe partnering two different race coaches or going into an area would be a positive. But then you get into the dynamics of recruiting where you only have 10 coaches that can go, yes, that is a stereotype. That's not what I'm saying necessarily either.
And I'm not saying
Inner
ignore.
city Dallas is a lot of white people as well, right? A white athletes. It's not one thing or the other. It's a lot of geographical, but the stereotype exists. But at the same time, inner city Miami is Liberty City. Miami is a hotbed for college football, right? There's correlational studies that relate winning national championships in college football and how well you recruit Miami in Liberty City, inner city Miami. And it happens to be that 98% of the population in inner city Miami, that Liberty City area, is Black, right? And from a lower socioeconomic background. We can't extrapolate that out. Having a coach, when I'm at Florida and Randy Shannon's on our staff, sending him there is immediate relationship, right? He can relate. He grew up there. He can relate to the athletes there. Sending someone that looks like me on the coaching staff, even if I take out race and just say I grew up in a rural area in the middle of Central Florida, I have no idea what these students' problems are, what they're looking for when they're being recruited. I can't relate to their experience growing up. So that when you're playing a time game, when you have to get to know people as fast as humanly possible, and you have to start courting them in a sense, right? To get them to beat Alabama, Clemson, and all these other schools in recruiting, if you can, having a jump start by someone on your staff that serves as a role in an assistant coaching role as recruiter that can relate to those athletes in that area is extremely important. So yes, fundamentally, sure, we coordinate recruiting that multiple coaches of multiple races or multiple backgrounds go to an area. There's a divide and conquer mentality because you only have 10 coaches that can go on the road and recruit. And then there's the immediate relationship piece that kind of affects that as well. So it's in football, as you alluded to, right? Football is so unique in who the athletes are compared to all other NCAA sports, right? Football players are unique, and so are men's basketball players in who they are and where they come from. And that's not stereotyping. That's, if you look at who scholarship football players are in the Power Five, there's studies that would tell you a baseline of what they look like, right? And they're extremely unique compared to other sports. So it's a good point. It's a good question. I think that you can't take that piece out of it though, and say, oh, wouldn't you, it might help the problem, but you can't, in my opinion, take that out.
I wasn't implying to take it out. I was suggesting finding other ways. Like, for example, you could have a coach called the recruit and then even say, I'm not going to be able to make it to the game, but one of my colleagues is going to be there and they're looking forward to it because I have to do, whatever. And so there's other ways to bridge the gap what I'm thinking is the players would then think, wow, there are more people at this program who get me, who look at me, as opposed to there are 11 coaches in this program and I can only relate to one of them. So it would broaden. It's a different way of looking at it, as opposed to doing things the same way all the time. You're going to end up with the same result and it doesn't change from that vantage point. You're still going, the Black coaches have to recruit the Black players, the white coaches have to recruit the white player. And also, I'm somebody who moved around her whole life. So if you went to my high school and assumed that I grew up there, the high school I graduated from, I was only there for my senior year. So wrong, So it's, there's a lot of other dynamics there is all I'm saying. I'm not saying eliminate anything. I'm saying think outside the box.
Yeah. And we're talking now maybe on more of a case by case basis. I think when you take in the whole universal field of coaching and right, I think that while there are maybe outliers and things like that in specific cases where you can do that, I think in a lot of cases that's something that, yes, reform needs to be made, right? Like that's a lot of what I look at. There's a lot. That's why I'm getting my PhD, and I left working in recruiting. I saw the issues and challenges and realized what was happening, and I didn't want to be a part of that anymore, right? Enabling a, in my opinion, systematically racist system and systematically racialized, I guess I should say. I shouldn't call it overtly racist.
I mean,
but
if Nick Saban comes to see you play, it doesn't matter. Like Nick Saban's coming to see you
yeah.
play.
So Nick Saban can only go see you once, and he can only go see you in the fall, though, right?
Right.
When your assistant coaches can go and see you multiple times a year. So it's a little different, and the head coach does carry the connotation, right, of oh, the head coach is here, but there are 10 other coaches on the staff that are allowed to go travel in the spring evaluation period and have a little bit more flexibility in the fall evaluation period too. It's a great point though, right? It's a conversation that needs to be had at the NCAA level too, right? And it's not being had at the NCAA level, and the NCAA, in my opinion, has not embraced a push for race and equity and promoting diversity and inclusion within college athletics. It's my personal opinion.
They can't do it at respective colleges, though. They don't have any authority.
That's a whole nother conversation.
I mean, they can't tell you how to run your college.
Yeah, exactly. Good.
Chris,
That's
I've got
a great conversation though. Sorry, who's
no, sorry. So Zach, I've got another question for you. So I know that you're mostly focusing on, Power 5 type of institutions, right? I don't know if you have looked into other types of institutions. Right? Do you find the same thing happening at D2 and D3 organizations, right? Or like, is this mostly just is this a Power 5 problem, or is this a entire culture within, entire country's culture problem?
I look at the Power 5 because it's so unique. It's completely Power 5 football is separate. It's not the same as Division 1, Group of 5, FCS even, right? It's not Division 2, Division 3. They're so different. It would be like comparing an apple to a banana. Like they're so different in terms of the commercialization and the purpose of college football in the Power 5 compared to all other divisions, that I focus specifically on Power 5 and really specifically I focus on the SEC, because I think within the Power 5, SEC football even takes on a further extreme of what football means in the South culturally, what football means to institutions within the SEC. And so for me, that's where I focus. The athletes being recruited in Division 2, almost all of them are on partial academic scholarship. That's totally unique and different compared to when we look at Power 5 football players. So I think there's immense value there, and something down the line I could see getting into and seeing, is this, because if it's not, it would further separate Power 5 football, right? And it would describe what I'm talking about in even more terms, a commercialization terms, right? Of what it means in the Power 5 from a monetary standpoint. So yeah, I think that would be interesting down the line. But right now, no, I've not kind of delved out of the Power 5.
You talked about coaches and the number, the progression from position coach, going up to head coach, and that there are more Black assists at the assistant level in different capacities than white, but when you get to the head coach, it's different. Do you factor in that those who don't want to become a head coach, or those who were a head coach and then either got fired or whatever and came back and want to be an assistant coach and don't want that head coach because they exist, or that the 60 or 70-year-old who been there, done that, don't want to do it again type deal? There's all different classifications of people who are there who just want to stay at that position coach or defensive coordinator coach level.
Yeah, that's something I've thought about. and have been pushed to figure out how to do that, right? What are people's motivations? It's a little hard, right? Outside of asking a very large sample of people, what's your motivation in coaching? Um, the assumption that I take and I acknowledge this in my writing is that football's a little bit unique compared to professional organizations, and I'm not talking NFL. I mean, in terms of entirety of business professional organizations, in that if a head coach gets fired, typically all the other coaches get fired too. So you're attached to the head coach, right? And so in that sense, I take this assumption that you're trying to become the head coach, right? You're trying to progress in your career to move up to, if we're going to use a business analogy, right, from mid-management to management, being a coordinator, and then to being the CEO as the head coach. I take that stance, but it's a limitation, right? It's something that I can't necessarily adjust for, right? It is exactly what you're saying. I've worked with plenty of coaches that are, no, I want to be just a teacher and be a position coach. I don't want the responsibilities of being a head coach. So it's something that's acknowledged, but not something that I have figured out exactly how to extrapolate out of the data.
And I would say football is not the only one that the whole staff gets fired.
Oh, for sure. Yeah. College
Yeah, it's
sports,
basketball. I mean, it's a
college
lot,
sports
most of the
specifically.
sport.
Yeah. You're attached to, and support staff too. Um,
Yep.
when I was at Florida and Jim McElwain got fired, I mean, everyone got fired, right? It wasn't just the 10 coaches. It affected everyone down to equipment and the training staff. And so it's definitely, you're attached to the head coach. Maybe one or two more questions if anybody has one.
Hey, Chris, this is Lana.
Yeah.
Can you give, you mentioned the Rooney Rule, and that is something that we cover in our basic sport management courses. Do you have, kind of with your expertise, do you have an opinion on the effectiveness and whether that's something that should be, I guess, removed, kept, revised? What do you think?
Yeah, I relate it to a tenet of critical race theory, right? And when you look at Derek Bell, one of the founders of CRT, and looking at Brown v. Board of Education and what actually that meant, right? And really all we remember as separate is inherently unequal, but really the outcomes of that are that no change happened, right? And a division furthered between white and black students in public schools in America. And I think the Rooney Rule serves a similar purpose, and I relate it to that in my writing and in the presentation of, it's something that is saying, okay, we're promoting equity, but really in action, it's not doing enough. It's not accomplishing what it needs to. And that's there are hiring initiatives in college that essentially are the Rooney Rule, right? And the NFL this year, we saw rewarding teams with draft picks for in addition to the Rooney Rule and doing that. And, there were a myriad of problems with that too, of not consulting enough people and not having representation when making that decision and whatnot. And no one's going to agree completely on if that's the right or wrong thing to do. But the Rooney Rule in practice as it is now, it doesn't do enough to promote actual equitable opportunities for coaches. It really, you serve as a token in a way. And I've talked to college coaches when I worked at Florida and Missouri that served as every year. I had a coach that I worked for tell me, one of my buddies is a head coach at another school, and he called and said, "Hey, I just need to interview someone to fulfill the requirement. Can I interview you? You're not a candidate. I just need to show," and it was explicitly said like that, like, you're not a candidate. I just need to fulfill this requirement. And I think that's where I have a feeling that sort of mentality has permeated a lot of these hiring decisions, but I can't prove that. It's just my opinion. Thank you all. That was great. I appreciate all the questions. It's a really important conversation. When we talk about promoting race and equity in sport, I mean, when most people think of sports, they think of the team and the coaching staff. They don't necessarily think of the marketing department or anything like that. And this is something that we talk about every hiring cycle, but nothing seems to change, right? And every year in January, February, it's the exact same conversation. Oh, well, what are we going to do this year? And then a year goes by. Oh, well, what are we going to do this year? Why does Eric Bieniemy not have a job? Why is Kevin Sumlin fired after 2 years, right? But Jeremy Pruitt's been there for 4, right? Well, we have the same conversations year in and year out, and nothing seems to change. So I appreciate all the questions and hope y'all enjoy the rest of the Q&As today at the conference. Thank y'all.
Thank you.
Very good, Chris. Very good.